Hi, I'm Izy, community builder and storyteller, passionate about amplifying the people who are reshaping our world through innovation, impact, and bold ideas. Welcome back to Conversations with Agents of Change. We explore the real journeys behind change, the courage it takes, the systems it challenges, and the ripple effects that transform communities and industries. Today, I'm speaking with someone who has been pushing for systemic transformation long before climate action became a buzzword. Professor John Barry is a leading voice in green political economy, a respected academic at Queen's University, Belfast for over 26 years, former co-chair of the Belfast Climate Commission, and advocate for a fair, just, low-carbon future. He's impatient for real change, and honestly, I love that energy. John, welcome to the show.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you.
John, for listeners who might not know you yet, how would you introduce yourself in your own words?
So I am a proud and worried father of two. I'm obviously a professor at the university. I am an engaged citizen and a long-time academic activist that tries to use my privilege as an academic, the knowledge I have, to try and shift the dial away from our current maladaptive, climate-destroying, inequality-producing capitalist system.
Amazing. I love the way you put every aspect of your life in it. So, mentioning from family to academia to activisms. I love that because this is very similar to how I would introduce myself. Like, I'm a proud mom, but I also love writing and I also love activism and I also like music. We are complex people. We are not just one label. Is that right?
Well, the reality is, particularly from the academic point of view, we too often see human beings as brains on legs, as if we don't have hearts, if we don't cry, if we don't have anger. And that emotional aspect has always been really important to me, even as a teacher, which we may talk about. But we are multifaceted beings. Not only do we have hearts and heads, we have hands. So where's the doing and the bodily? We need to attend to our bodies as well as our minds and our emotions. And so for me, the head, the hand, and the heart must always be the way we understand each other. Too often we're just focusing on ideas, and it's impartial at best and can be quite risky and dangerous and harm producing if we only narrow people down to one thing. We are much more than we often feel ourselves to be.
Absolutely agree. And very often we would acknowledge people just for what they've done, their achievements or the titles. And I find that it's very unfair because there's many people out there who are actually changing the world and they don't really have many titles, which I don't think they are related one to the other. I think there's a lot of people who can be doing brilliant things without the titles or vice versa. There are people out there with very big titles and they are not doing enough, and that is frustrating.
It's certainly my experience. It's often women. I mean, where I get quite a lot of my politics and passion is I come from a family of strong women, a very working class background in Dublin. And it used to annoy me when I would think back about when my mother would introduce herself. Oh, I'm just a housewife. She was a political activist as well. I mean, one of my earliest political memories is in the working class housing estate I lived in. A child had been sadly killed by a car because there was no pedestrian crossing. And despite the community asking for the local council to put one in, nothing happened. So what the women did, the women of the community just sat down on the road. They just blocked the road and they got the traffic lights put in. And so for me, that is where I think real political change can come from people who don't see themselves. Like my mother, like all the other mothers, would not see themselves as political activists. They were just mothers doing the best they could for their children. But in the process of doing that, they were, of course, excellent political activists. They could also budget. They were also able to navigate bureaucracy for the local council. So I think it's about platforming and recognizing that people can be doing fantastic things, but they may not see themselves as actually agents of change or political activists.
Absolutely. And I so agree with that because so many times I've talked to people, it's like, I would like to interview you for the podcast. And they will like, but I haven't done anything. It's like, but I see your work and I only know like the surface of what you've done. So come to the podcast and tell us all about it. And I love that story about your mom and how you see people doing what other people would say they are small actions. I want to to know if there's any other event that sparked your journey into the green political economy. What was that flexing point that you realized, I want to dedicate my life to this?
It probably was when I went to university, which by itself was a journey. I've always been class conscious, so I've described myself as an eco-Marxist with a strong degree of feminist perspectives. But I only went to university because my father, who was a factory worker, he had an accident, which meant our family income went below the threshold for 1 year that I could get 1 year's support to go to University College Dublin. Otherwise, my family couldn't afford to send people to university. So even me getting to university, I was aware of the class dynamics because once I went to university, I was surrounded for the most part by the children of middle class professional people. And the world they came from was completely alien to me. They had cars, they went away on foreign holidays, they came from nice communities that had things that my community didn't have, like green spaces and so on. And so for me, even though at that stage, I didn't have enough kind of Marxist or socialist analysis to understand why is it that that community that these people come from has nice things. And when I went home to my community, oh, it wasn't terrible. I'm not saying it was in poverty, but we were poor. And it was that issue of class dynamic. Why is it these people have so much? And yet my mum and dad are working hard, the people around me working hard, and we don't have as much. Our houses are much smaller. We don't have cars. I remember that was a big thing in my family when my father bought our first car. He was one of the first on the road I came from. So that was the kind of class consciousness for me in realizing also I wasn't the brightest person in my class. There were other kids who were brighter than me in terms of exams and so on, but they never went up, had the opportunity to go to university because they couldn't afford. And that made me angry. And I do think we have to acknowledge that for many political activists, certainly for me, I am angry about this system that we live in that denigrates people, that they don't have the same opportunities as others. And while I was at university, I was able to connect the class consciousness that I had with an analysis of colonialism. Because I'm Irish, like a lot of Irish people, it's what we grow up with. We understand we were a colonized people. We're still living with the legacies of colonization. So I could see common cause with what was happening at that time in the 1980s when I was at university, of the Costa Rican rainforest being cut down for cows that were then used in McDonald's. Because I had to take a job, like a lot of students, I had to work in McDonald's. So I was able to connect, the capitalist system as I understood it in Ireland and the class divisions, and also then with colonialism and the exploitation of people and places in the global south, particularly in Latin and South America at that time. And so for me, they both fitted together. The same system that was exploiting my community was also exploiting the Costa Rican rainforest and the people there. So for me, from that point on, probably maybe the late 1980s, I became what you would, as I said earlier, an eco-Marxist. I could connect the ecology with this kind of class analysis, but also colonialism and anti-colonialism has grown even more important in my activism and academic work, not least now with what we see in the world and what's happening in West Asia. I refuse to call it the Middle East. The Middle East is a colonial concept. It's West Asia. And the genocide in Palestine, the illegal war in Iran. So for me, I have long understood this is how imperialism works. Colonization did not end just because countries in Africa and Asia or Latin America got formal freedom. They were still under Western domination.
Absolutely. And I can relate so much to that. I'm originally from Mexico myself, so I see lots of funny interactions between countries and between people that believe that some people are better than others and whatnot. And some of the things that you said there, I can really relate because I didn't know where food come from because I was originally from a big city.
Mhm.
So whenever I moved to Ireland, I saw cows for the first time. And it might sound so ridiculous for some locals. For example, I wasn't near any land. So whenever I saw the cows and the beautiful eyes, I thought like, we must do something about it. It's not just the animals, it's the children, it's the people, it's the insects, it's the plants, it's the use of land and the different crops. And so there's so much to do. And how do you overcome when you think there is so much to do? Where should we start?
Well, I think you have to appropriately align what you can do with your energy and resources, and also build in time and space for self-care. On the last issue, I've seen it so often in my decades of activism in particular, so many burnt out people who become cynical, they're broken because they didn't pace themselves in terms of understanding. And it's particularly difficult in left wing circles where we're not very good at talking about emotions, of care, of being compassionate, of talking about love and kindness. These words don't often fit the kind of hard Marxist revolution and so on. So anyway, I've always tried to introduce that issue of care and compassion and self-care into anything you do. But also seeing that, for example, I am a white male heterosexual professor with lots of status and academic and financial resources. So I can do things. I have options that other people can't have. And I feel it particularly that those in privileged positions like me, we should be lifting more of the burden than a young single mother who's on welfare benefits and so on. Of course, we're all connected as citizens, as humans, but some of us have more privilege. And with that, I think, comes responsibility. And I feel it particularly acutely within the academy, of which I'd be quite critical, that there aren't enough people like me going out into the community, helping. And don't get me wrong, academic colleagues and academics are doing good things, but they can be doing so much more, because I see myself as a publicly paid intellectual. Your taxes and the people listening to this podcast, your taxes pay for my wages. So my obligation is, yes, I must teach and I must do my research, of course, but also where's my public duty? So for me, I've always had that sense of the public duty of the privileged, particularly because I have high levels of autonomy in my work. I have a lot of freedom that most of the workers don't have.
Yeah.
And I should be able to use that in a way that can help my community, but also listen. This is the really difficult thing for people like me, the kind of alpha male professor and activist, where I have had to really work hard not to lecture people outside and tell them what to do. Now, often I do that. I'm trying to listen before I tell. That's why you have two ears and one mouth, as my father always reminded me.
That's really good insight, because I think that that would solve many problems in the world. Just listen more and stop before we say things and before we act. And that would take me to the question. We have already mentioned that you spent 2 decades working in universities. And how do you think the academia has shaped or maybe sharpened her commitment to the systemic change?
Well, knowledge is power, so arm yourself. I mean, my mantra, if you like, for political activism is from an old revolutionary organization in America called the Industrial Workers of the World. They were called the Wobblies. They're still around. And their slogan was educate, agitate, organize. So it begins in awareness. I mean, I think a lot of the problems in the world, not all of them, are that a lot of people literally are ignorant. They don't really understand how the world works. Why is Donald Trump doing what he's doing? Why do we have a world where the American way of life is consuming so much of the world's resources? Why is America the major, reason for our climate crisis and so on? Why is our world so unequal? Why is there always money for war and not for our national health service and so on? So for a lot of people, it is about trying to, bring them some knowledge. Obviously, I'd be giving them a class analysis, one that's based upon the legacies of colonialism and racism and obviously Marxism. From my view, I think capitalism has served its purpose. And all of this analysis I'm giving you has come from my research over 35 years in this area. I'm even more radical now than I was in the 1980s. And the reason is that the science is now much more compelling. That's telling us we cannot continue with a business as usual model. There is no capitalist solution to the climate and ecological crisis that we have. We have to say that capitalism itself is now part of the problem, including things like economic growth, which is why my area of research is post-growth green economics. And what that means is that post-growth is only for what I call the minority world. Europe, North America, Australasia, Japan, South Korea, the so-called advanced countries. These are the minority world, where maybe 20% of the world's family live. So We need growth in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. That's where growth is needed. But in Europe, what we need is more redistribution. We're all growed up. We don't need any more growth. And in fact, we can go into the details of why most people don't understand what even economic growth is. There's just this sense, oh, we have to have it, otherwise bad things happen. And that's partly out of ignorance, genuine ignorance of people not understanding. We don't need growth. We can have all the things that we need in our society: good, healthy food, decent public services, good education, a health system. We in the global north, the minority world, we don't need growth. And therefore, the question is, in whose interest is it to continue with this economic growth based system? And I would say it's in the interest of an elite that we can see ever more clearly, the Epstein class, that we can now call it. So, as an academic over the last 35 years, I have sharpened my analysis, and now I'm so pleased and I feel so grateful that the scientific community, because I'm a social scientist, I work in a school of history and anthropology and politics, but I'm now seeing that the natural sciences in ecology, in the climate science, they are coming to the same conclusion. We cannot continue with a capitalist system. And indeed, why should we think that's a major problem? It's simply a historical phase of our societies. And this idea that we can imagine a future endlessly as the same system we have now is absolute nonsense. Name me historically any system that has lasted forever. Human beings always change and evolve. So for me, capitalism is simply a stage of development. It's now become maladaptive. It's now causing more problems than providing solutions. And we need to move beyond it, particularly, as I say, in the global north. And so for me, just to finish, my always enduring, if you like, ideological commitment to anti-capitalism based upon normative values of freedom, of autonomy, of equality, and solidarity amongst people and democracy. Those are the kind of ideological bases, if you like, of my own Marxist view. But they have now been aligned to the hard science. We cannot continue with a capitalist system, and that's okay. We are talking about the end of the economic world as we know it. That does not mean the end of the world. It just means the end of the current system that we're in, and to move on to create something better, which we can talk about maybe in a moment as well. But what that post capitalist world might look like.
I would love to hear that. And it just shows how, on one hand, the growth, it has a different meaning. It's a growth in a different sense, maybe not in a narrow way that is
Yeah.
not just economic, but it's a growth in how we care about our people and we care about the community and we care about environment and so on and so forth. But also, I want to point out that I found that the way you describe teaching in a very powerful way, because it sounds to me that teaching for you is a form of activism. That
Yeah.
I'm going to pass this on to these young people, and it's passing on. It's a rebel way to say, I'm going to help from a different angle, which I love. And that just brings me to another question in terms of research. So, if you're not only research climate transitions, but you have helped lead them as a co chair of the Belfast Climate Commission, so, what was your vision for that commission, and what was your proudest moment?
Well, just before I get to that, just when you're
Yes.
talking about teaching, and again, it's a South American connection. My pedagogy and teaching practice is informed by a wonderful radical educationalist called Paulo Freire, who wrote a wonderful book in the late 1960s called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And it was basically the radical idea that the best form of teaching speaks to the lived experience of the learner. So it's not about seeing the learner as a blank page. Particularly communities in struggle, in the favelas of Brazil or in the working class communities that I came from, people have a lot of knowledge. Okay, they may not have degrees or have the language and so on. And so for me, I've always approached the students I'm learning by trying to bring out from them their lived experience and how can Marxism or climate change analysis help them understand their own world. But also, as part of that, I am probably sadly one of the few very democratic teachers at the university. What I mean by that is that from the first year right up to PhD and postgraduate level, I allow the people that I teach to choose up to 50% of what we learn. So I would teach half of it, and then I'd say to the class, okay, what do you want to learn about these issues? And now it's a lot of work, a lot of extra work and so on. And it means that, for example, for somebody who has no interest in fashion, I know an awful lot about Shein, Pretty Little Thing, Boohoo, and social influencers, and all, because this is what the students want to learn about. And it's good for me because now I'm teaching things that are connected to that generation. In terms of the Belfast Climate Commission, I found it immensely worthwhile. It was based upon a 5-year project. I also found it very frustrating because my radicalism was not shared by almost anyone else as part of that commission. And that's a normal part of life. You're going to be with people who have different views. But I found it really interesting and, in a way, quite hopeful that if you gather people, so there were people there who were business people from big companies like Arup, which is a multinational engineering company. We had people from Friends of the Earth, the radical environmental group. We had the trade unions there. We had business people. We had people from the council and academia. So it was great to see that sense of community, or at least a community of interest, being developed. And again, as I say, we didn't agree on everything,
Yeah.
but what we did agree upon is the importance of having the knowledge base. So there are two reports that the commission produced that I'm very proud of. One was we mapped out a plan for net zero for the city. And what we found was, and this is a unique element of Northern Ireland, or the north of Ireland, or Ulster, or the occupied six counties, all the names we have for this place, that because we depend so much for our space heating on oil, we also then which is a very volatile commodity, as we now know, with the illegal war in Iran, we see already massive increases in oil. But not only that, we found in Belfast, we have some of the worst insulated homes. So that, in other words, people are paying a lot of money for oil, and then they're often heating the street because the heat has not been kept in the house. So what we found in the report by the commission is that the best way we could reduce our carbon emissions at a cost-effective manner was not about installing solar panels or heat pumps or getting people to buy electric vehicles and so on. Actually, just insulate people's houses. It would lift people out of energy poverty. It would reduce the health impacts and respiratory problems people have living in hard-to-heat homes, which I also witnessed firsthand when I was a local politician as a councillor, which we can talk about as well. So that's the first report I was really proud of. The convening power, bringing all these groups together, then doing this analysis. And the other one relates in a way to what I was talking about a moment ago with students, is we did a report on the climate anxiety of young people in the city. And it was frightening because we surveyed, I think it was 1,500 young people from the age of 16 to 25. And I forget the proportions now. It wasn't the majority, but quite a high minority of young people had climate anxiety. They were worried about the future. But what made them even more worried was when they looked to government or other institutions and they weren't seeing the action being taken. And so for me, that was, both of those reports are like baseline analysis. One about the emotional mental health impact of the crisis. The other one more technical in terms of how do we figure out solutions. But sadly, because the commission, we had no decision-making power. Our job was to offer advice. Neither of those have been taken up. We have not seen a mass retrofit program for Belfast in working class communities, which I think is a terrible shame. In my view, this is a political winner. This could be a form of green populism. Who'd not want to have a warm home? And I think politicians would benefit in terms of getting votes, but there's no political party is doing this. Well, maybe the Greens, obviously. And of course, as a Green Party politician, just to be clear to your listeners why I'm saying that. So for me, they're the two or maybe three proudest moments: the convening of these different interest groups, and those two reports. But sadly, like a lot of academic research, we can produce the analysis, but it's up to government or businesses or other organizations to implement them. And sadly, we've not seen the level and the ambition of climate action, which is why, as I describe on my LinkedIn page, which people should go and look at because I kind of subvert
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
business friendly. You see an interesting picture of me on my LinkedIn page, but I describe myself as an increasingly impatient professor wanting climate action.
Which I absolutely adore because I feel like there is so much urgency that we need to keep looking at. But at the same time, I agree and I can relate to that anxiety. It's a bit of what I was asking earlier in terms of how do we cope with all these. It looks like an emergency everywhere, but I love the way that we can use the research and the analysis of things to actually make decisions. Now, I think it's a bit more push into the politics and say, look, this is the research, that's back it up, that's what the people want, so that's what needs to be done. Now, I think that in an ideal world, that's what would happen. Now, I know I'm not a politician or I haven't been involved in politician or I want to be involved in politics, but I think that it's a lot of different agendas from different groups. So I suppose it's trying to work those hand in hand to see like what's going to happen and what decision is going to go, what movement is going to go first. And it just reminds me personally that for me, climate policy, after what you have said, is not just the technicalities of it, but it's very human. It's about connecting with the students and connecting with the people and connecting with the communities. And as you had said, like I wouldn't believe there's one person in this country or in this part of the world that wouldn't be happier to have a warmer house. And it also reminds me that there is sometimes we want to fix problems with a very ambitious solution when we only have to look and
Yeah.
be practical about it instead of just trying to design
Right.
something that's very
Particularly
complex.
often we don't need technological solutions to these things. We need changes in policy and how, you know, we organize our societies. But part of the problem, the green movement and the climate movement has suffered from a kind of an elitism, a language that doesn't connect with working class people. And what we need to do is connect the cost of living crisis with the climate crisis, to show to people that actually climate action is going to make your life better. Because too often the green and climate movement is seen as a guilty, educated, middle class concern
Yeah.
and not something that's for working class people, which I think is absolute nonsense. And
Yes.
we now see this being used by the political right. Oh, climate policies are going to cost you more. We need more fossil fuels. The very thing that's causing these extreme weather events that we already see around the world, particularly in the global south. So there is an issue of how do we develop a working class climate politics, which I actually think we are already beginning to see. If you look across at England and see the English Green Party under Zach Polanski, and of course they defeated the far right Reform Party in Manchester recently, and it was around this issue of connecting green politics with making your life better, material concerns for people. It is about trying to see that you're going to have cheaper, more energy secure homes. You're going to have good, local, ideally organic or at least not chemicalized food. And therein lies an issue. Why should organic food cost more than chemical food? That's only happened in the last couple of decades. So it is about showing to people that the policies around addressing climate will improve the quality of life. Our city air will be cleaner because we won't have as many internal combustion engine cars. Let's have more cycle lanes, more green spaces. But then more radically, is that we need to think about moving beyond measuring a good life in terms of the amount of things that we consume. Of course, we do. There are many people in our society that aren't consuming enough, in terms of the quality of life that they can have. But also, there's a point beyond which what we need is meaningful free time. Once we have our health taken care of, food, energy, education, transport, what we need then is to see that any technological or other changes actually mean we have more free time.
Yeah.
I really am very skeptical of a lot of these technological push now, particularly with AI, around increasing our productivity. My view is feck productivity. I don't want more productivity where people are stressed in work. I want more people working less rather than less people working more. Let's use AI to clean the sewers, to do all the really horrible jobs that often racialized minority communities are doing now, often gendered. Let AI and technology do all that horrible stuff. I don't want AI to make my music. I don't want AI to infect my students when they're trying to do their essays and so on. And yet I really fear that we have this uncritical push of AI that's only going to serve the interests of the tech bro capitalists in California. the Bezoses and Zuckerbergs and so on. And I really do fear that we're not having as much critical discussion around AI in particular. You could say it's almost too late. I don't think it's too late. We should have had these conversations maybe a decade ago.
Yeah.
And so I really am concerned about this kind of happy, clappy AI is going to be brilliant. And it's been pushed at us all the time. You go onto a search engine, and now the first thing that pops up is AI. And it's almost like how a drug dealer operates. If they give you a small bit of the drug, maybe for free and so on, and then you become hooked. And we already know that this technology is addictive. I mean, there was a case in California just yesterday of a woman who successfully sued Meta for producing platforms that are addictive. And I hope we see more of that. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant there.
No, I agree. That's brilliant. And you know what? It just makes me so curious because you were speaking before about the post-growth economy. So I wonder, like, how do you explain that? Because to me, it sounds like a very abstract concept. So how do you explain it in a way that it feels accessible to all of us?
So I ask people, and I do this in the public speeches I give and also in class. I say, but to people, what does growth mean to you? And for most people, they aren't really sure. They hear about all the time on the news, and they have some vague sense of even political parties, vote for us, we'll increase growth and so on. And I begin to explain, well, what does growth mean? At one level, as a kind of a very shocking way of bringing people into this conversation, I could say that economic growth in Northern Ireland could be produced by us producing more Bibles and selling them, and that increase economic growth. But I said it could also be about increasing pornography and selling them. Economic growth is indifferent. And then that gets people, okay, well, what does this actually mean? And then I say, well, do you know that the unpaid work of women, and it's mostly women who do this work, that every day keeps our societies going, without which our societies would collapse? The cooking, the cleaning,
Yeah.
the part-time counselling for the spouse and the children or old people. I said that's not included in GDP. And GDP is gross domestic product. It's the dominant understanding of economic growth. And I said, why is that? And I said, I'll tell you why. And then I go into the history. A bunch of white guys from Europe in 1930s, they invented the GDP concept, and they excluded the work of women. They included the military. So military spending is included, but the work of women, you say, well, who made that decision? Again, it was based on politics and ideology. So part of my argument is that the GDP and economic growth concept is not neutral. It is a politically and racially, because it's also anti non-white communities and societies, because in a lot of communities and economies in the world, they don't operate through the formal cash system. People are often involved in barter. I buy this and we exchange it for this. And that's how, even in my experience in a working class community in Dublin, that's how a lot of people got by. They didn't have
Yeah.
cash, but they exchanged favors. And ultimately, in my view, they're all economically valuable. Those exchanges that don't take place through the use of money, but they're all excluded from GDP. And then, of course, the ultimate obscenity of this GDP concept is war. War is good for the economy, but certainly the American economy. And you say, what a nuts idea. We've invented this, totemic objective of society of growth. And we will even sacrifice our young people for it in war, or indeed, as we've seen in the UK and elsewhere. So when we had the global financial crisis in 2008, we had 10 years of austerity. So there was cuts in public services and welfare, all justified by bringing us back to growth. And we know, well, the epidemiological evidence, the medical evidence is that almost 200,000 people died in an advanced UK economy because of those cuts. It's almost like going back to ancient civilizations like the Aztecs or the Incas and so on that sacrificed to please the gods. In my view, we're still in that moment almost. We think we're modern because we have technology, but we still live in mythic societies. But our myth now is economic growth. So the issue is, what really matters in life? It's food, it's relationships, it's time, it's healthcare, it's transportation. And so the argument I would have is that economic growth has outlived its usefulness now. We can have those things without economic growth. In fact, economic growth, like capitalism, has passed a threshold beyond which now we have uneconomic growth. It's causing more problems than solutions. And that is a very challenging idea because for most people, when you hear growth, it communicates things like development, maturity, progress, and so on. So I understand people's resistance when I talk about post growth and so on. But I think, yeah, if you have the time and people are open, you can begin to unpack this concept of economic growth and say, well, maybe there's a point of it. When an economy is poor, you need to bring people out of poverty and growth is good. But how many pairs of shoes do you need? We've only got one stomach. This endless, rapacious consumerism itself is problematic. And just to finish, an issue that people don't fully understand about consumerism, excessive consumption, is that it's often based upon getting people into debt. So people are borrowing money to buy things they don't need to impress people they don't really care about, all based upon the importance of marketing and advertising. That's why there's one thing for the folk listening to our podcast can do. Don't buy beauty magazines. They will only make you feel ugly. That's the point of them. The point of advertising and marketing is to provide some sort of lack in your life. Oh, I must have that, and so on. And we need to resist this because it's, as I say, it's getting people into debt. And when you're in debt, your options are limited. I actually think a lot of the reasons why young people are not as politically active, perhaps, as they were in the 70s and 60s, is because they're paying for university education. It's based upon debt. And when you're in debt, that is a barrier to being involved in other forms of activity. So it's a very clever way for the capitalist system, in my view, to prevent political mobilization against it by presenting people with this vision of freedom based upon buying crap. And unfortunately, we've fallen for this, particularly with the online world. It is so mesmerizing, it's so novel, it's so enticing, it's so seductive that it's very easy to have our minds colonized. So I mentioned colonization as a historical phenomenon, but also our minds are being colonized now by these online systems.
It's so interesting. And I am mesmerized by what you're saying because I have this argument before. I don't believe that we need any more of what we have. So I will be fighting as a mother, I will be fighting with other parents and say, look, children don't need as much for Christmas. They need experiences. We all need more experiences than gifts and physical gifts. And it's very difficult to change that in society. And I agree, it has to do with the way marketing has been working the past years. So it's very difficult. However, I don't think it's impossible. And I think it's working very well. And I think it has to do with the way we communicate with each other and how there is a say that I really like. It's from Buddhism, but it can apply for anything. And it's be the drop that moves the ocean. So
Mhm.
when you start doing something and you start bringing that to the closest people you are with, and it kind of rubs off. And I think that is a very good and interesting idea. So about that, I wanted to ask you, what do you think that would be the easiest way to start moving to, like personally as an individual, into a post growth mentality? And say, okay, I just don't need that, but not just in a way that I'm not going to buy things, but more critical and say, what do we need to shift within our heads?
Yeah, well, you could ask a very basic question. Who do I want to be? What
But
does it mean to be human at this moment? And but also to fully appreciate that individual change by itself will not create the bigger change. It's important, don't get me wrong, in terms of making different food choices, making things, not buying things. We
Mhm.
even at the very basic level of human relationships. And for the parents listening to us, and I'm sure you're the same, you're a parent as well, maybe not very aesthetically pleasing painting that your toddler makes for you, it has more meaning than, like, for me, the Mona Lisa or buying something because it has a story attached to it. It is deeply meaningful because it's about communicating relationship and love. So you making a birthday card for a spouse or your friend carries with it so much more meaning because you know what? You've taken the time. Whereas you could go in and buy a really expensive card for £15 and it looks really great and so on. Say, well, big deal in a way. Don't get me wrong, folks. If you haven't got the time, and that's the issue I'm getting at, I think a lot of the consumerism is based around swapping time for love almost. I
Yeah.
mean, there's an old academic article that goes back to the 1950s, and it plays on the word economy, where it says, what do economists economize? And it turns out it's love. Our whole capitalist system is about reducing care and compassion into transactions. So you could start with mulling over those ideas, those words I've just said in your own mind about, well, does that resonate with you? And so, why is it I can't have more free time? And to start with that, but also to see that there's a collective effort involved here, and we shouldn't be bereft of hope. Human beings have done tremendous things. We've seen countries becoming free, in terms of the anti-colonial struggles around the world. We've seen we're not there yet with more freedoms for women or LGBT brothers and sisters. For the black community, it's still not perfect by any stretch of imagination. Just think of in Northern Ireland here, we've had 30 women murdered since 2020. So we have a long way to go, but we have made progress. So we should never doubt the fact that human beings collectively, and that's the key issue, collectively, you should not think that you recycling more or you not flying, that somehow that's your job done. That's the start of the process. You must also get engaged in collective action, and that includes educating yourself about these issues. So I do question this kind of individual behavior change model, that it's individuals. We need that. In my view, these individual actions are both be the change you want to see in the world.
Yeah.
So I am conscious of my own hypocrisy, and I do talk about this. And we should just recognize, listen, I have a car. Okay, it's an electric car, but I probably should be cycling more, but I do cycle and I take public transport. And so it's not trying to present yourself as a paragon of virtue. In the system that we're in now, this, in my view, horrible carbon energy capitalist system, it's very hard to escape this degree of hypocrisy. Even for somebody like me who's aware, I do fly because I have to do that for my work and so on. So I think it's about recognizing the hypocrisy of being implicated in this system, but being aware of it, but and doing what you can on an individual level. Maybe not banking with Barclays Bank. If anyone's listening to me, they are a horrible bank. They're not only bankrolling the Israeli genocide through war bonds in Gaza, they are also bankrolling some of the biggest oil corporations and exploiting for more oil. So now change your bank is one way. Or if you have investments, divest from the military, divest from oil and so on. So you can do individual things, but I think it's about collectively coming together. It's like that old African saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, you have to go together. Now, we have to
Absolutely.
go both fast and far together. So it is about that combination of but individual action by itself will not work. It has to be political and collective. And it's actually great fun. A sense of community and purpose can be found in the action. And the last thing I'll say is that even regardless of the struggle you're involved in, of its outcome. Of course, you don't get involved in political activism and you don't want to get involved in change making without seeing that you want the change to come about. That's almost like a Buddhist view. We should let go of the outcome in
Yeah.
part, that the purpose is the struggle itself, the sense of camaraderie, of people coming together, as I will be marching on the streets of Belfast tomorrow for Palestine. Do I think that our march is going to result in liberation for the Palestinian people? No, not necessarily, but it is part of the process. And actually, also, it helps people being able to do something because people feel, what can I do? Well, you can make your voice heard. And as I say, there's something around that idea of seeing the struggle itself as meaningful, even irrespective of the outcome.
Absolutely. And it has to do with that a sense of being part of something and work towards a goal, even if you can't get there. And it's about like none of us going to get out of this life alive. So, but what are you going to do in the meantime? What are you going to show you care about? And what are you going to support? What are you going to bring awareness to? And I suppose it has to do with what are you supporting yourself as an individual in the communities you volunteering or the banks you support or the corporations you support or the politics you support. And that brings me to the question about when you served as a Green Party councillor for over 7 years. And how did stepping into politics change your perception into on what really makes change?
Well, I would encourage everybody to try being a politician at least once in their lives. I mean, it's an old ancient Greek perspective that also Greens have, which is that really we should choose our politicians by lottery. Just say, okay, Izzy, it's your term. For the next 2 years, you're the local councillor. Because often, in my experience, the very people who want to be politicians are the very ones who shouldn't be.
Exactly.
Yeah, so of course, I would say, well, not in my case, of course, because I went for politics for the good reason. Like, yeah, you could see, well, there's an example of hypocrisy. And it is a duty. Being in politics made me more Marxist, made me even understand that the political system we have at the moment is absolutely broken. It is failing, a bit like our NHS. So many systems that we have depended upon are beginning to collapse in different ways. And I found that the liberal democratic political system itself is not able to deal with the big issues that we've been talking about here. Now, in part, you've got to recognize that at the local council level in Northern Ireland, they have very little powers. It's basically graveyards and bins and the local parks. So it doesn't have a lot of power, unlike other jurisdictions where the municipal government, maybe in Mexico or even in England, has a lot more power in terms of healthcare or housing and so on. So I was frustrated by seeing how little power actually councils had, but also I was in a minority. I was the only Green at one point in the council. I felt like the only gay in the village, you know, talking about these issues we're talking about, and the other politicians not only didn't understand me, but absolutely were against almost everything I had to say. Some of them were born again Christians, evangelicals in the Democratic Unionist Party who don't believe in climate change. The same as Trump and so on. That's very frustrating for an academic like me, where I'd be saying, well, where's the science? Like, tell me, why do you not believe?
Yeah.
So for me, it was a good experience. And I tell you why, is that I mentioned earlier that I'm the kind of alpha white male professor with a lot of status and so on and privilege. But I was dismissed. I was ridiculed. I was rejected. I never won any debate on council because I was in a minority. And when I left politics, I was reflecting upon this so that I felt frustrated. I wasn't able to win. But I did have some minor successes in working with others and so on. But for me, as a man in particular, I said, as a white man, oh, is this what it's like to be a woman or somebody from an ethnic background where your eyes rolling off, there goes John again about climate change or whatever. And for me, that lesson was very good, in terms of it's a bit like what my father used to say again, when you lose, don't lose the lesson. And so for me, that was one of the things I took away from the frustration of being in a minority, of being ridiculed and dismissed and so on, is that it's given me, I mean, I was always a feminist. I was always conscious of racism and so on. But it's kind of hard as a white man to fully experience life for someone who is a woman and or also a member of an ethnic community. So just maybe even more of a feminist, more anti-racist and so on out of it. And what I would also say is that it made me have to go and be close to the people because I had to go and knock at their doors looking for their vote, or they would contact me about an issue that they had mold in their house. So I went to see how people lived. And it would break your heart when you go into a house and they would have a flat screen television, they would have IKEA furniture, and there may be a car outside. And so they'd look as if they had all the trappings of success. But I knew for a fact they had no food in the fridge and they were sleeping on blankets with no beds upstairs. And to me, it was a damning indication of our society. Why is it people feel that they have to have these consumer things to feel valued and so on? Why is it that the council area I lived in, as Ards and North Down, there are large pockets of extremely wealthy people, millionaires, judges, well-paid academics like me, and then there are also very poor working class areas. And so it really brought out the class divisions in our society, which it's say with some more redistribution, and we're not saying everybody has to be absolutely equal,
Yeah.
but by taking more money off the rich and giving it to the poor, we'd improve the lives of everybody. without diminishing the welfare even of the rich and so on. So for me, that experience of being a politician, as I say, was frustrating at a point, but it's also a privilege in representing people and trying to make their lives better. And for many people, what I found, just to finish, Izzy, is that, when I would explain to them, listen, the issue you're talking about, that's for the Department of Education or the Department of Infrastructure. The council doesn't deal with roads or whatever. I found that for many people, all they wanted to do was to be listened, to be taken seriously, for somebody in authority, as I was as a councillor, to actually take them seriously. And even if you're not able to fix the problem that they have, sometimes I could, many times I couldn't because it wasn't a council issue, you realize that people just want to be heard. They just want to be taken seriously and to spend time with a cup of tea and to listen to their story. Even if at the end of the conversation you say, listen, I'm really sorry, but I can't help you, but I'll try and contact the department for you and so on. So for that human connection is just so important. That's also what I fear about this AI digital age we're now living in. Don't get me wrong, I use the internet, I use social media platforms, but I do think they are no substitute for human connection, particularly face to face, and to bring us back down to what it means to be human. So for me, it's almost like for me as a politician, it was only simply a continuation of what I've always felt: the importance of human connection, and community, and building up some sense of solidarity and sympathy and empathy. Particularly, as I say, for those who have privilege, they don't know what it's like to be hungry, which is why I think everybody should take a chance at being a politician, because you do come up to face with the lived lives of other people.
I agree completely. I actually, a few years ago, took a lovely course, and I'm hoping to bring those people along. That was called a Women Breaking Barrier. They held a women into politics training, and I loved it. But at the same time, I realized that I might not be as resilient as need to be for to be a politician. But it was really hard to see how you have to struggle in every room to have your voice heard, even just heard, not to take in
Yeah.
action for what you want to do. And it's really difficult, but at the same time, I think it's very empowering for people to think, yes, we should do that. It's worthwhile to make an effort and to have the uncomfort of being looked at and being having eyes
Yeah.
rolled and stuff like that. So I agree completely. And I would invite people to actually look into that, even if you are not actually going to go all the way in, but at least if you have the sense of what it means to put yourself in the shoes of other people. And I think that as part of that, it just shows you when the people, in my belief, there's two ways to do things: people who want to do things or people who are forced to do things. So for
Mm.
people who want to do things and they are very impatient to do things. So you have described yourself as a very impatient for climate action.
Mhm.
So how does that productive impatient actually looks like? How do you stay motivated when you see like such slow progress?
Well, as you can probably tell, I'm quite an energetic person. Get
Yes.
this from my mother. I very rarely get depressed, although sometimes I think I'm a carrier of depression, given all this heavy knowledge I had about the climate crisis and capitalism and so on. But for me, part of my resistance and resilience is to always be upbeat as much as possible. Now, without being naively optimistic, you have to be honest with people and say we're in a really bad situation. It's getting worse. But actually, this should be our reasons to celebrate small wins, to come together and laugh and, share jokes and so on. So joking, I found to be, and humor more generally, an amazingly resilient producing characteristic. That you can help other people in a meeting by being humorous, as I found. I like to think that I'm quite a good lecturer in terms of, yeah, the climate crisis, but bringing in jokes and showing funny memes and so on. Because there's many ways in which people learn. So you got to try and, connect with
Yeah.
all the different ways. So for me, a lot of self-deprecating humor as well. So against myself. So again, I'm upfront about how hypocritical parts of my life is, given what I've said. I know the difference between what I want to see in the world and what I can live my life in a particular way because of that. So I think there's something around recognizing the limits of your own positionality in many ways. But I do think that impatience comes from the urgency of the crisis that we are facing. You know, I don't want to depress you or your listeners too much, but the new normal is not going to be what we've experienced with these severe storms, for example, here. So we had Storm Eowyn in January last year. We had Storm Chandra. We've experienced extreme wet. We've had the wettest January on record. That's not the new normal. The new normal is going to be worse. And we're going to have to start adapting our built environment, our food system, and so on, because we failed to take action on the climate crisis. We now have to live in a climate destabilized world. So that's where my impatience is. Seed over, as I mentioned there, into anger. And I am angry. I'm angry at the injustice. I'm angry at the failure of our governments and political parties to make the changes that would improve the lives of everybody. But it does mean letting go of capitalism. It does mean letting go and recognizing the evils of colonialism, the legacies of racism and gender inequality. All of these things are interconnected in my view. And it's the anger, in a way, that keeps me going as much as anything else. Even though I have to admit that the world I want to see into being is fairly far away now, given how horrible the world has become, particularly under Trump in America, and particularly what he did to Venezuela. I mean, to go in and kidnap
Yeah.
the head of state, regardless of one's views of Maduro. This is disgraceful. And then to see the governments of Europe say nothing.
Mm.
Imagine if Vladimir Putin had kidnapped Keir Starmer. That's what we're looking at. I mean, this crazy world we now live in, where we've normalized genocide. So for me, all of that is about the impatience and the anger, backed up, I think, by the facts, backed up by an appeal to the basic decency of human beings. I think most people are decent. They want fairness. They want the best for their kids and other people's kids. But we are being manipulated as a people by elites in the media, for example. Absolute gobshites like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan, these very powerful white men who are infecting our young people, particularly our young men, with this toxic masculinity. That's what makes me impatient and angry. But I see that as part and parcel of my anti-capitalist commitment as well. And so for me, what keeps me going is it's partly based upon my activism in the last couple of years with the Palestine movement and against the genocide. And I forget which Palestinian said this. They were talking about Western people like me involved in the pro-Palestinian movement. And he said something very powerful, which has struck with me. He says, "You have not earned the right to be hopeless." They are in the midst of an apocalypse, an ecocide and a genocide, and yet they are still resistant. And there's this wonderful Palestinian word called Sumud, Sumud, and it means steadfastness, it means resilience, it means defiance, where your existence is resistance, as it were. So for me, I have not earned the right to be hopeless. Whether it's about the Palestinians, whether about the future for my kids and your kids. And that's what keeps me going. Even now, as I'm speaking to you, I am becoming more energized in the fight. And I think the more we talk about these things, we can lift each other up. Yes, we can challenge each other. And some of the ideas I have, people might think are batshit crazy and not going, that's okay. But if you don't like my ideas, well, what's your solution? Tell me why I'm wrong. Tell me why, for example, that I'm wrong in my view that there's no capitalist solution to this crisis. Technology ain't going to save us. I mean, a belief in technological solutions is a bit like jumping out of an airplane and knitting your parachute on the way down. We don't need any new technology. We have all the technologies we need. We have all the resources we need. But the problem is, like where I live in North Down, the resources are in the wrong places. A small minority have a lot and a majority don't have enough. We don't need growth to solve that. We don't need technology. But what we do need, Izzy, is a revolution. And that's why I am a revolutionary. There are now no non-radical solutions left. We cannot continue with business as usual. Tech is not going to save us. Ideas of green growth and the circular economy, nonsense in my view. They are distractions. We need fundamental revolutionary changes in how we heat, how we eat, how we organize the economy, how we educate our young people, how we deliver public health, and so on. So for me, I can back everything I've said up by the science, by the social science, and so on. And I know it would strike many people listening, oh my God, he's gone crazy. Is this Friday night rather than Friday morning we're talking, and I've drank too much and so on? No, folks. I am here to tell you very clearly we need revolutionary changes. If you care about your kids or your grandkids, you have to join the struggle wherever you can in trying to shift our societies away from this obsession with economic growth, with capitalism and pro-market fundamentalism as a way of organizing our society, and absolutely to move away from carbon energy, coal, oil, and gas. So that's why, in my view, I am post-growth, post-carbon, and post-capitalist.
I love that. And fun enough, I think that many of our listeners will actually resonate with what your that emotional tension and the desire for systemic change. And I think that most of us are very much in that spirit, and we want to see things changing, and we just don't know how to. And the fact that, as you said, we kind of empower each other by telling us we can do this, and we are looking to the right direction. So I really love that. So I just wanted to speak directly. So I wanted you to tell someone who feels very powerless in the face of climate change, what would be the one message that you tell us or tell them to take away today?
There's always hope. Maybe explain how I summarize often my activist life is that when I was younger, I was a red hot communist in the 1980s. And I thought the revolutionary changes that I wanted to see, some of which I've outlined in our discussion, was like a sprint. You have to get there really, really quickly. As I got older, I said, oh, maybe it's not a sprint, maybe it's a marathon. It's got to take longer and so on. And actually, now I believe neither of those. It's a relay race. So, in other words, I'm engaged in political action, the fruits of which I may not live to see. And that you're passing on the baton, you're passing on the struggle, your knowledge, your support for the next generation. And that's not an admission of defeat. This is how change happens. I mean, my impatience might make people think I want to have changes tomorrow. I'm realistic. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but sometimes changes can happen very, very quickly. So I think for me, I've reconciled myself. I'm going to be 60 this year. I'm kind of looking at retirement and what can I do as an academic. I'm still going to be involved in activism. I'm still fit and healthy. But it's almost like seeing that the best way to reconcile yourself to trying to make change in a large systemic manner. No, I'm talking about large social changes like within societies and so on, that it is around a long term, of sometimes a multi-generational approach in terms of moving from that naive view, oh, it's a sprint, to the more, maybe mature view, oh, it's a long time, it's a marathon. When actually what we should do is let go of the responsibility that you are going to live to see that which you started. So it's, whether you want to use the analogy of a baton and a relay race, or where I'm sowing seeds, the fruits of which I may not live to see. My children may live to see, or if they have children themselves, my grandchildren might live. And I am content with that. But what it means is that when I'm on my deathbed, and as you're right, we're all going to die. I can look at my children and say, you know what? Your dad was woke. He was awake at this moment. He tried. I hate the way that word woke has become a term of abuse. Why would you not want to be awake at this time? With these great opportunities. And of course, while the world is in a terrible state, the politics that motivates me are about the opportunities that if we make these changes on the climate and ecological issues, we will have better lives. I mean, my view is that the changes we need to make our societies more climate resilient, more ecologically sustainable, less gender oppressive, more racially inclusive. Well, it's like getting a postcard from a beautiful holiday destination. I'm talking about a 3 or 2 day working week. I'm talking about having great public services, not dependent upon you having to buy healthcare or education and so on. I am talking about a socialist society that for many people, oh my God, that's like the Soviet Union and so on. That's not the only model available. And the issue is that if you don't accept my analysis, that's fine. Okay, show me why your analysis is better. Where's the evidence that, for example, this capitalist system that we're now in, that's showing signs now of itself collapsing? I mean, for Marxists like me, What we're seeing in the world now is capitalism in decline, and that's called fascism. We've seen this before, the rise of fascism. So for me, it's about, to your listeners, be aware of this beast that is now awoken. It cannot be solved by the current system. And to look at in our history at the ways in which we can see revolutionary changes that have happened in the past. The reality is, polite women did not get the vote. We have to be radical. We have to basically adopt the words of George Bernard Shaw, wonderful Irish playwright and activist. And he said something very profound in the early part of the 20th century. He basically said, the reasonable person adapts themselves to the world. And he said, the unreasonable person adapts the world to themselves. And that's why we need to be unreasonable. It's not about us adapting to the current system. We need to adapt the current system to our deepest human feelings, aspirations, and values.
That is so beautifully said. And that's exactly why we wanted you in this show. I think we needed to be reminded of all that power and strength that we have as humans, as a part of the community. And I love that, John. So thank you so much for sharing just not just your expertise, but your commitment and the way you perceive a livable future. Your impatience, your clarity, and your dedication is reminding me, and I hope that of our listeners as well, that change happens when knowledge meets courage. And
Yeah.
I feel very energized today. And for our listeners, if today's conversations inspire you or change you or gave you a new perspective, share it with someone who needs to hear it. I'm Izy Boyd, and this has been Conversations with Agents of Change. Until next time, keep questioning, keep imagining, and keep building the world that you want to live in. This podcast is produced by the Change Impact Group.